In the summer of 48 BCE, Julius Caesar found himself in a position that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. He was chasing Pompey the Great across Greece, his former ally turned bitter enemy, with an army that was outnumbered nearly 2-1. The civil war that had been brewing for years had finally erupted, and now these two titans of Roman politics were about to face off in what would become one of the most decisive battles in ancient history. But let's back up a bit, because you need to understand how we got here. After Caesar's tumultuous year as consul in 59 BCE, he had spent the next 9 years conquering Gaul, and I mean all of Gaul. He pushed Roman territory all the way to the Rhine, crossed into Britain twice, and generally made himself into Rome's most successful military commander since Pompey himself. Caesar had gone from being a controversial politician to a legitimate military genius with a battle-hardened army that was fanatically loyal to him personally. This was a problem. Back in Rome, things had gotten complicated. The first triumvirate, that secret alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, had started to fall apart. Crassus had died in 53 BCE, getting himself killed in Parthia in what was honestly an embarrassing military disaster. Then in 54 BCE, Caesar's daughter Julia died in childbirth. This was significant because Julia had been married to Pompey, and she was basically the only thing keeping these two men friendly with each other. With both Julia and Crassus gone, there was nothing holding the alliance together anymore. The conservative faction in the Senate, the same guys who had tried to sabotage Caesar's consulship, saw their opportunity. They had spent the last decade watching Caesar accumulate power and glory in Gaul, and they were terrified. They started working on Pompey, playing to his ego, reminding him that he used to be Rome's greatest general before this upstart Caesar showed up. They convinced Pompey that Caesar was a threat to the Republic, conveniently ignoring the fact that Pompey himself had been that exact same threat just a few years earlier. In 50 BCE, the Senate, with Pompey's backing, demanded that Caesar give up his command and return to Rome as a private citizen. This was a death sentence. Caesar had made a lot of enemies during his year as consul, and the second he stepped foot in Rome without the protection of his office, he'd be buried under a mountain of criminal charges. Caesar countered with a proposal. He'd give up his command if Pompey gave up his. The Senate refused. Caesar tried again. How about they both give up their commands on the same day? The Senate refused again. Finally, in January of 49 BCE, Caesar made his move. He crossed the Rubicon River with a single legion, officially invading Italy. Civil war had begun. Now here's the thing that nobody expected. Caesar won, like immediately. Pompey had spent months preparing for war, but when Caesar actually showed up, Pompey panicked and fled Italy entirely. He retreated to Greece, taking most of the Senate with him, and left Caesar in control of Rome and all of Italy without a single major battle. It was kind of embarrassing, honestly. But Pompey wasn't done. He had a plan. See, Pompey had spent years in the east and he had connections everywhere. He started calling in favors, raising armies from all the eastern provinces and client kingdoms. Meanwhile, Caesar had to deal with Pompey's forces in Spain, which took him most of 49 BCE to sort out. By the time Caesar was ready to go after Pompey in Greece, Pompey had assembled a massive army. We're talking about 11 legions, plus thousands of auxiliary troops, plus cavalry from all over the east. Caesar had maybe half that number. In January of 48 BCE, Caesar made his move. He loaded his army onto ships and sailed across the Adriatic Sea to Greece. This was risky because Pompey controlled the seas, but Caesar managed to land most of his force on the Greek coast. His lieutenant Mark Antony was supposed to bring the rest of the army across, but Pompey's navy was blocking him. For months, Caesar was stuck in Greece with only half his army, unable to bring the fight to Pompey. Caesar decided to go on the offensive anyway. He marched his army to a city called Dyrrhachium, where Pompey had set up his main base. Caesar's plan was to besiege Pompey, which was insane because Pompey had way more troops. But Caesar was betting that he could cut Pompey off from his supplies and force him to fight on Caesar's terms. Caesar built a massive fortification line around Pompey's position, basically trying to trap him. Pompey responded by building his own fortifications facing Caesar's. For weeks, these two armies just sat there, staring at each other across these elaborate defensive works. It was a weird situation. Finally, Pompey made his move. He found a weak point in Caesar's lines and attacked, breaking through Caesar's fortifications and forcing Caesar to retreat. This was Caesar's first major defeat in years, and it was a disaster. Caesar lost about 1,000 men, and his army's morale took a serious hit. Pompey could have pursued Caesar and probably ended the war right there, but he didn't. Maybe he was being cautious, maybe he didn't trust his own troops enough for a full pursuit. Whatever the reason, Pompey let Caesar retreat. Caesar pulled his army back and started marching inland into Thessaly. Pompey followed, but at a distance. See, Pompey's strategy at this point was to avoid a major battle. He knew he had more men, more supplies, and more resources. If he just kept following Caesar around, eventually Caesar's army would run out of food and fall apart. It was a solid strategy, and it was working. But then politics got involved. Remember all those senators who had fled to Greece with Pompey? They were getting impatient. They had been following Pompey around for over a year now, and they wanted results. They started pressuring Pompey to attack Caesar and end this thing. They called him a coward. They said he was dragging out the war because he enjoyed having all these important senators dependent on him. They said maybe he wasn't so different from Caesar after all, maybe he wanted to be a tyrant too. This got to Pompey. He was the great Pompey, conqueror of the East, and these politicians were questioning his courage. He started to waver. His officers, many of whom were aristocrats themselves, joined in the pressure. They wanted a battle. They wanted glory. They wanted to go home. Caesar, meanwhile, was in trouble. His army was hungry, his men were tired, and he was running out of options. He needed Pompey to fight him because if this turned into a war of attrition, Caesar was going to lose. So Caesar started looking for favorable ground, somewhere he could force a battle on his terms. In early August, Caesar's army arrived at a place called Pharsalus in central Thessaly. It was good ground with a wide plain perfect for a major battle. Caesar set up camp and waited. Pompey arrived a few days later and set up his own camp about 4 miles away. For several days, Caesar would march his army out onto the plain and offer battle. Pompey would march his army out too, but he'd stay close to his camp, refusing to commit to a full battle. Caesar's troops started mocking Pompey's men, calling them cowards. Then on August 9th, something changed. Caesar had marched his army out onto the plain as usual and was about to give up and march back to camp when he noticed something different. Pompey's army was marching out onto the plain too, but this time they were moving away from their camp. They were accepting battle. Caesar immediately ordered his men to stop their march and prepare for battle. His officers were surprised. This is what they had been waiting for, but now that it was actually happening, the reality of the situation hit them. They were outnumbered badly. Pompey had about 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Caesar had maybe 22,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. This was not good odds. But Caesar's men were veterans. They had been with him in Gaul for years, fighting in some of the most brutal campaigns in Roman history. They trusted Caesar, and Caesar trusted them. He rode along the lines giving a speech. We don't know exactly what he said, but ancient sources tell us he reminded his men of everything they had been through together. He reminded them that they were fighting for their own survival, because if they lost, Pompey and the Senate would show no mercy. He reminded them that they were better soldiers than Pompey's men, most of whom were recent recruits from the East who had never faced real combat. On the other side, Pompey was giving his own speech. He told his men that Caesar's forces were exhausted, hungry, and demoralized from their defeat at Dyrrhachium. He told them that this would be an easy victory, that by nightfall they would be celebrating and this whole mess would be over. His officers were already arguing about who would get Caesar's property when they marched back into Rome. Both armies formed up in the traditional Roman triple line formation, 3 lines of infantry with the most experienced troops in the front line and the reserves in the back. Pompey put his best legion, the 1st Legion, on his left flank. Caesar put his best legion, the 10th Legion, on his right flank. These 2 elite units were going to face each other directly. Here's where things get interesting. Pompey knew that Caesar was outnumbered in cavalry, so Pompey's plan was to use his massive cavalry advantage to win the battle. He put all 7,000 of his cavalry on his left flank, along with his archers and slingers. The plan was simple. His cavalry would sweep around Caesar's right flank, hit Caesar's army from behind, and cause a total collapse. It was a good plan. It should have worked. Caesar saw what Pompey was doing, and he had to come up with a counter-strategy fast. He took 6 cohorts from his 3rd line, about 2,000 men, and formed them into a 4th line behind his right flank, hidden from Pompey's view. He gave these men specific instructions. When Pompey's cavalry charged, they were to move forward and attack the cavalry directly. But here's the clever part. Caesar told them not to throw their javelins like normal. Instead, he told them to hold onto their javelins and thrust them upward at the faces of the cavalry riders. Why? Because Pompey's cavalry were mostly aristocrats and wealthy young men from the eastern provinces. They weren't professional soldiers. Caesar was betting that these pretty boys would panic if someone started jabbing spears at their faces. It was a psychological tactic as much as a military one. The battle began with both sides advancing toward each other. According to our sources, Pompey had ordered his infantry to stand still and receive Caesar's charge, thinking that Caesar's men would be exhausted by the time they reached Pompey's lines. But Caesar's veterans were too smart for that. They advanced to about halfway, saw that Pompey's men weren't moving, and stopped to catch their breath before continuing the advance. This was not standard procedure, but these were experienced soldiers who knew how to pace themselves. The 2 infantry lines crashed into each other, and it was brutal. These were professional Roman legionaries on both sides, and they knew how to fight. The front lines pushed and stabbed and died, and neither side could gain an advantage. It was exactly the kind of grinding infantry battle that Caesar wanted to avoid, because Pompey had more men and could sustain losses longer. Meanwhile, on the flanks, Pompey's cavalry began their charge. 7,000 cavalry plus archers and slingers came thundering around Caesar's right flank. Caesar's tiny cavalry force of 1,000 men took one look at this and immediately retreated. It looked like Pompey's plan was working perfectly. But then Caesar's fourth line, those 2,000 men he had hidden in reserve, suddenly appeared. They moved forward in formation and did exactly what Caesar had told them to do. Instead of throwing their javelins, they held them like spears and started thrusting them at the faces of Pompey's cavalry. And it worked. Pompey's cavalry panicked. These were men who had signed up for glory and honor, not to get stabbed in the face by some sweaty infantryman. They turned and fled, leaving Pompey's archers and slingers completely exposed. Caesar's fourth line cut through the light infantry like a hot knife through butter, then swung around and hit Pompey's main infantry line from behind. This was the turning point. Pompey's left flank, which had been holding steady against Caesar's 10th Legion, suddenly found itself being attacked from two directions. They started to fall back. The fall back turned into a rout. Pompey's entire left flank collapsed. Pompey saw this happening and completely lost his nerve. This was the great Pompey, the conqueror of the East, and he panicked like a rookie. He left the battlefield, rode back to his camp, went into his tent, and just sat there. He didn't try to rally his troops. He didn't try to organize a defense. He just gave up. Caesar's forces, meanwhile, were pushing forward all along the line. Pompey's center and right flank were still fighting, but with their left flank gone and their cavalry scattered, they were in an impossible position. Some units tried to retreat back to Pompey's camp, but Caesar's men were right behind them. Caesar ordered his men to bypass Pompey's camp for now and focus on the enemy soldiers who had retreated to a nearby hill. These men were trapped, exhausted, and demoralized. Caesar surrounded the hill and called for their surrender. They gave up without much of a fight. Only then did Caesar turn his attention to Pompey's camp. His men were exhausted from the battle, but Caesar wouldn't let them rest. He knew that if he gave Pompey time to regroup, this could turn into a longer campaign. He needed to end this now. Caesar's men assaulted the camp, and Pompey's troops, who were supposed to be defending it, barely put up a fight. The camp fell, and Caesar's men found themselves surrounded by unbelievable luxury. Pompey's officers had been so confident of victory that they had set up elaborate tents with ivy-covered pavilions, tables laden with silver dishes, and fresh flowers everywhere. It was like they had been preparing for a victory banquet, not a battle. Caesar had to physically restrain his men from looting the camp. He needed them to keep pursuing Pompey's fleeing forces. By the end of the day, Pompey's army had been destroyed. Ancient sources claim that Pompey lost about 15,000 men killed and another 24,000 captured. Caesar claimed he lost only 200 men, though modern historians think it was probably more like 1,200. Either way, it was a decisive victory. Pompey himself fled the battlefield with a small group of cavalry. He rode through the night, eventually making his way to the coast and boarding a ship. He sailed to Egypt, thinking that he could find refuge with the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII. Remember Ptolemy XIII, the guy who had bribed Caesar and Pompey for recognition back in 59 BCE? This was his son. But when Pompey arrived in Egypt, Ptolemy's advisors made a calculation. Pompey was a loser now and Caesar was the winner. If they harbored Pompey, Caesar would be angry. If they killed Pompey, maybe Caesar would be grateful. So when Pompey stepped off his ship onto a small boat to be rowed ashore, Ptolemy's men stabbed him to death. The great Pompey, the man who had been Caesar's friend, then his rival, then his enemy, died in a small boat in Egypt, murdered by people he thought were his allies. He was 58 years old. When Caesar arrived in Egypt a few days later, Ptolemy's advisors presented him with Pompey's head, thinking Caesar would be pleased. Instead, Caesar wept. Whatever Pompey had become, he had once been Caesar's friend and ally. More than that, he had been a Roman, and he deserved better than to be murdered by foreigners. Caesar had Pompey's head cremated with full honors. The Battle of Pharsalus had been decisive, but it hadn't ended the civil war. Pompey's supporters regrouped in North Africa and Spain, and Caesar would spend the next 4 years hunting them down. But Pharsalus was the moment when the outcome became inevitable. Caesar had defeated Rome's greatest general with an outnumbered army through superior tactics and the loyalty of his veterans. The battle also revealed something important about Caesar's character. He offered clemency to Pompey's soldiers who surrendered, incorporating many of them into his own legions. He pardoned most of the senators who had fought against him, including Brutus, yes, that Brutus. Caesar wanted to win the war, but he also wanted to heal the Republic afterward. Whether he succeeded in that goal is another story. Pharsalus changed the course of Roman history. It ended the Republic in all but name, though it would take another 15 years and another civil war before Augustus would officially establish the empire. It proved that the Roman political system was broken beyond repair, that military power trumped political legitimacy, and that the age of the Republic was over. But in the moment, standing on the battlefield of Pharsalus, surrounded by the dead and dying, Caesar supposedly said something that ancient historians love to quote. He looked at all the casualties on Pompey's side, many of them Roman citizens, and said, they would have it thus. Even I, Gaius Julius Caesar, after so many great deeds, would have been condemned had I not appealed to my army for help. In other words, they brought this on themselves. Caesar had tried to work within the system, and the system had tried to destroy him, so he had destroyed the system instead.